Welcome to Lesson 3.4, all about the corrections part of the justice process. In today's lesson, you'll need to know two Supreme Court cases, a couple of the sentencing options available in corrections, why we use the corrections system, some issues that involve incarceration today, and the status of capital punishment. So there's 5 parts in today's lecture. Remember to take good notes. Now, just as we talked about with due process when we dealt with searches, seizures, arrests, and dealing with the procedural due process of trials, there's also going to be due process related to punishment. So the first protection that you have to give you fair legal treatment in punishment is the 8th Amendment that prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. And the Supreme Court has ruled in Furman v. Georgia that a punishment is prohibited if it meets those 4 items listed there, any one of those 4. Now, in 1972, what the Supreme Court decided with Georgia was that their use of the death penalty actually violated all 4 of those, that it was wrong on all 4 of those levels. But 4 years later, the Supreme Court said that Georgia had changed how it had done the death penalty, basically, and said, okay, fine, we'll allow you to use it. So the death penalty has gone from being unconstitutional to being constitutional depending on how it's used. As long as a punishment fits those 4 requirements and doesn't violate a single one of them, then it's okay. Later on, the Supreme Court has ruled that punishing juvenile offenders and intellectually disabled offenders with capital punishment is unconstitutional and violates their due process, though. So let's say that you got found guilty at your jury trial or your bench trial at the end of that last lecture video. You have a few options that basically the court could impose upon you. And usually the judge will make this decision to avoid any arbitrary designation of your punishment. So the first option is you might just get probation, which is maybe the best option out of these 4. It would be a release with good behavior. There might be a restriction on your personal liberties. You might have to wear an ankle monitor, for example, to monitor where you go. But that would be similar to home confinement, which is the next item there. And there could be another element that's like, we'll allow you to leave your home in order to go to work or something along those lines. But basically, if you're on probation, it means, hey, you better not screw up again or else we'll send you back for the full length of a much longer sentence. You could have to pay a fine or restitution to your victims. That's a fairly common way of dealing with certain crimes. Or you could be incarcerated in a municipal jail, such as depicted there, the St. Louis County Jail, for up to 1 year, or a state or a federal prison for more than a year. So state prisons would be obviously for state crimes, and federal prisons would be for federal crimes. Now, underlying the entire corrections process, there are 4 kind of broad theories of why we punish people. The first is we want to deter crime by frightening the general public or the defendant themselves into avoiding crime in the future, and potentially even saying, don't do the crime unless you can do the time. A second theory of punishment is the idea of retribution. We would want to actually prevent the people, the public, from trying to seek out their own vengeance against the defendant. So we'll basically take that out of their hands and say the state is going to punish them. That's called retribution. The third is called rehabilitation. And this is the idea that we would want to prevent the defendant from relapsing into crime through what's called recidivism. That's the idea of they commit another crime afterwards. So while they're in prison, we would want them to go through programs and kind of learn how to rejoin society. Unfortunately, more than 50% of people who have been convicted of crimes actually end up usually returning to prison. We're going to have a guest speaker visit our class who will talk about his efforts to lower the recidivism rate of many federal prisoners. And probably the final and easiest one to understand is simply restraint or incapacitation. That's the idea that someone who's truly violent or presents a danger to the safety of society should be removed from society temporarily until they no longer present a danger to society. So why do we care about these things? Well, think about the idea of the death penalty. Well, does it meet the real idea of deterrence? Does it meet the idea of retribution? Does it meet the idea of rehabilitation? Well, clearly it doesn't rehabilitate offenders because you don't plan on rehabilitating them at all. Does it restrain them? Does it remove them from society? It's a good idea to weigh the punishments against these theories of criminal justice. Why do we punish people compared to what do we want to get out of this particular punishment? Now, while people are incarcerated, there are some things to consider about that situation. There is this concept known as parole, which is the idea of being early released from prison. It's distinct from probation because a parole is the idea that you did serve some element of your sentence, and then you were released upon good behavior and the promise of good behavior. So a similar idea behind probation and parole, but they are technically different things. Prison conditions have been a major concern in the United States, and there's a long list of problems that there are with various issues related to prisons, but they really center on overcrowding. The United States has some of the highest per capita incarceration rates in the world, and we have the largest prison population in the world. More than 2 million people are incarcerated in the United States. So compared to any other country on earth, we have far more people who live in prison at any given time. And that is something to consider, as is that the kind of society that we want, and is government fulfilling its role? So our final issue for today is called capital punishment. That's the idea of someone receiving the death penalty. There's some information for you there about the current status of capital punishment. There have been about 1,500 people executed in the United States since 1976. The vast majority were executed for state crimes, not for federal crimes. So when we talk about the death penalty, it is mostly in actually a few states. Although 31 states allow it, it's only a handful that are responsible for the vast majority of those executions. There are a significant number of criticisms of it. We found that it disproportionately affects minority populations and low-income populations. People who can't afford good attorneys often end up receiving the death penalty. It actually does cost more than a life in prison without parole because there are more appeals and there are confinement issues. Somebody with death penalty sentence is often in solitary confinement to avoid future problems. The lethal injection drugs are often very difficult for states to get, and they have resulted in extreme pain for the defendants, and there's questions about whether due process has been preserved in that context as well. So going forward, capital punishment is a major debate in American politics even today, so it's something to know your stuff about. So hopefully you've taken good notes today, and we'll see you next time.